Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Castillo. I'm Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Coordinator for the Master of Urban Design program here at Arizona State University. I'll be your moderator tonight on YouTube, and we're super excited for this joint lecture between the Design School and the School for Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. In particular, our speaker tonight is a bridge really between architecture planning, landscape architecture, and urban design. Let's welcome Dr. Linda C. Samuels. Dr. Samuels is an associate professor of urban design at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches architecture and urban design studios and seminars on infrastructural urbanism and urban history and theory and alternative sustainability metrics. Before joining WashU, Dr. Samuels was in the inaugural director of the Sustainability City Projects, a multidisciplinary research, teaching, and outreach initiative of the University of Arizona, where she worked on micro and macro scaled sustainability efforts in Southern Arizona and the larger mega region. Dr. Samuels earned her PhD from UCLA and her MArch from Princeton University. While at UCLA, she was a senior research associate at CityLab, an urban think tank in UCLA's Department of Architecture and Urban Design. Samuels' most recent book, Infrastructural Optimism, is now available from Routledge. It's been really a pleasure to work with and get to know Dr. Samuels over the last several months. Her work has really changed my understanding of urban infrastructure and urban design, and you are about to hear why. Let's give a big virtual welcome for Dr. Linda C. Samuels.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction and really for all the work you've done bringing this lecture to this room, this virtual room, and the larger project that we're collaborating on here with the Belmont Partners and the University City Exchange. And thank you also to the Design School and the School of Geographical Sciences as well, and Urban Planning at ASU for partnering on this effort. Hello also, before we get started, to my ASU friends, faculty and students, and all the guests who are joining us in this virtual room. And a big thank you at the very beginning as well for the people who have worked on some of the projects that I'm going to show tonight. The work that I've been sharing has been produced by teams, not just by me. And so thank everyone who's contributed to that work and to the growth and development that it's allowed in my research over the years. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And let me know that that's coming in clear. Paul, you see my screen?
Looks fantastic, yes.
All right, great, thanks. So I want to start by talking about optimism. And I know it might not seem like the moment that we're all thinking about optimism right now. Not the most obvious time to feel optimistic in terms of the conditions that surround us. But I want to talk first about what does it mean to be optimistic and how this project has sort of informed that concept. So I remember the exact day that I finished this book, and it was April 20th, 2021. And I was looking out my window in St. Louis and it was snowing. And from Phoenix, where it was, 75 degrees today, that might not seem like a weird date. But in St. Louis, our frost date, the last date where it's supposed to freeze, is April 1st. So the fact that it was snowing on April 20th was already odd. I was also feeling pretty crappy. So when I hit the send button on this PDF, as excited as I wasn't feeling very good. In addition to thinking about all of the ups and downs of 3 different presidential administrations that this process had gone through, a great recession, 10 years prior in terms of that sort of housing boom and bust, and the beginning of a pandemic wave, really the likes of which none of us had probably ever even imagined, at least none of us here in this room. It was just crazy that it was snowing at the end of April. So I knew I was fortunate that I had gotten vaccinated in late January and early February. So the fact that I wasn't feeling so good, everyone was like, oh, it's it's allergies, or maybe you have a cold. Well, after I sent that PDF in, I went and got tested and I had COVID. And I was the first breakthrough case I had ever heard of. So I was really kind of struggling to be optimistic at that moment, I must say. And I realized, though, in reflection, right, this personal colliding of circumstances was, of course, just a microcosm of the more universal colliding of circumstances. So the pandemic, global climate change, ravaging wealth disparity, the swell of social uprising, the political uncertainty, even this instability in our democracy, yet optimism persists. And I want to talk about how and why optimism persists. Al Gore said this: "I always come down on the side of hope." And he didn't say this when he had just completed his run for presidency, which, was enough reason to not be optimistic. No, he said this after the 2016 election, just after the US had withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord, which was one of his signature accomplishments. Yet still, he said, "I always come down on the side of hope." And his argument was, even in the face of this major step backwards, he talked about, well, mayors are stepping up and, state governors are stepping up to fill the gap where the federal administration is stepping back. PV panel prices are dropping. Electric battery storage is getting more accessible. Optimism. And he's not the only one. America, in all of its sort of pro and con, has a history of sort of expansion through optimism, manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, Western migration. Even the Depression era Works Progress Administration, the WPA, that was really an effort in morale building. The New World Trade Center, Build Back Better. These are all ideas of the way optimism comes together to create this sort of collective morale. So optimism, very broadly, is the belief in a better future. But there are two kinds of optimism. One is this personal optimism, the individual belief for yourself, your career, your goals, that you will have a better future personally. But the other is this idea of collective optimism, the belief in a better future for all of us, a better future for society, for all of society. And this is the important kind of optimism when we talk about design of the built environment. This is infrastructural optimism. And infrastructural optimism, and this is opportunism that I'll talk about in a second, but infrastructural optimism is based broadly on a concept that everyone deserves to believe in a better future for themselves, for their children, for the planet, but mostly a better collective future. And that our investments in infrastructure, our largest public space, our commons, our shared resources, how we access and distribute them is the very basis for our quality of life, that this optimism, this infrastructural optimism, should be contributing to that better future for all of us rather than detracting from it. That is infrastructural optimism. Infrastructural optimism asks that we collectively imagine that we collectively produce that, whether we are working as designers, as policymakers, negotiating property rights, setting priorities and values, making decisions about who we work for. The future that we collectively produce should improve the social, environmental, and economic outcomes. So how do we do this, right? This is the big question. And one way is this concept of infrastructural opportunism. So infrastructural opportunism is the concept that we should be leveraging the trillions of dollars going into infrastructure investment, particularly on the heels of these two federal spending bills, which hopefully will both be approved, not just for maintenance, not for generic efficiency, though we know we're 75 years behind in terms of our maintenance, but for added and equitable social environmental benefits. And this is what I call shifting from the red arrow to the green arrow. Shifting from the red arrow to the green arrow scenario is also the same as sort of shifting from last generation infrastructure to next generation infrastructure. So last generation infrastructure, and these two images are the same site. This is Cheongtaechen in South Korea. So last generation infrastructure is where is infrastructure that is resource intensive, it is spatially and socially disruptive, it is often environmentally damaging, and typically does one thing at a time, sometimes not so well. Next generation infrastructure contributes to the reduction of these damages and divides, recognizes infrastructure as a public amenity, reintroduces integrated systems-based thinking into city design and planning, and utilizes interdisciplinary collaboration and design thinking to improve the quality of experience for everyone. So what do I mean by next generation infrastructure? Well, the concept for me emerged while I was a senior research associate at UCLA City Lab during my time as a PhD student at UCLA. And I co-planned this design competition with Dana Cuff, Roger Sherman, and Tim Higgins. And the thesis statement of the competition was a call for innovative design-based solutions that would be worthy of a national level effort to revitalize cities and put the public back in public works. And this was a particular moment in time. So what was happening as in terms of the context that encouraged us to create this competition? So I often refer to 2000 to 2010, the disaster decade. So we were seeing tragic and highly visible infrastructural collapses. You know, the most predominant, probably the collapse of the levees after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in the Gulf Coast. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave us a D average on our nationwide infrastructure. And, you know, the very small good news is we're now a D plus. So room for improvement, still room for improvement. Obviously, we were around 2007, 2008, 2009, we were in the Great Recession. So high unemployment in the design and construction industries. What were we going to do with that excess creative energy? The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was investing in infrastructure, but this is the first time we kind of use this phrase, let's find shovel-worthy, not just shovel-ready projects. We were also gaining more interest as designers and planners, particularly as designers, in environmental accountability. So movements like the Green Roof Initiative in Chicago, or the quantification of sustainability through metrics like LEED. In addition, we were thinking more about how we might design for social accountability. So an improvement on sort of pro bono work. This was really work that was attacking problems more specifically through design. Architecture for Humanity came around in this time period, and this global competition for refugee housing saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of architects actually focused on solving social problems through design. This project in the bottom left, Pitch Africa, is one of my favorites because it looks like a soccer field, so it brings people together socially, but it's actually also a water harvesting facility with water storage beneath it. But in addition, it's an HIV/AIDS clinic. So if you have a mom who could bring her son or daughter to play soccer, and it was stigmatized to get tested or treatment for HIV/AIDS, there could be a sort of much more subtle way to receive the treatment that you might need. We also started to see model projects. So NL Architects, which is an amazing firm doing work around a lot of next generation infrastructure, this A8 ERNA project on the top, or the High Line, which has since become not only famous, but often copied. But these were romanticized infrastructural relics becoming real public space projects. And so those are sort of the first 5 things that were happening. And then the 6th is really a change in the urbanism discourse. So for those of you who are urban design, urban planning, landscape architecture and architecture students who are reading history theory, the 80s and 90s was really a sort of pessimistic moment in our design history of cities. So this was the neoliberal postmodern city, turn towards privatization of public space, what was often called the death of public space. And our response to those problems started to change in the early 2000s, the response to privatization and the response to sprawl. And they really changed in 3 sort of schools of thought: everyday urbanism, landscape urbanism, and new urbanism, and the progeny to these movements. So they spread in many, many, many ways. And I don't want to talk about them individually. I really want to talk about how they influenced the change in the early 2000s, the change towards what I want to talk about, which is infrastructural urbanism. So several things were pulled from each of those movements, but primarily the everyday urbanism movement provided this moment where we started to talk about the right to the city. Who deserves to participate and occupy public space? We started to talk about multi-scalar economies, multivalent publics, and personal agency. In landscape urbanism and ecological urbanism, we started to talk about the city as a space of flexibility and adaptability, the importance of ecological performance, systems thinking, and cross-system symbiosis. And from new urbanism, we started to talk about the importance, again, of public space and placemaking. So from the postmodern urbanism era of the 80s, 90s, we kind of shifted through these 3 new urbanism types and ultimately to what I'm arguing is a moment of infrastructural urbanism. And infrastructural urbanism is vastly different from the sort of master planning of the ages before. So it's integrated rather than segregated. It's networked rather than autonomous. It's inclusive. It's flexible. It's cross and multidisciplinary. It's bottom up as well as top down. It's ecological as well as economical, and it's outcome driven rather than object focused. So it has a sort of performative drive to it. So these 6 conditions were really the intellectual and physical context within which we launched the WPA 2.0 competition. So the competition was a global competition. Most of our entries came from the US, but we still had entries from all over the world. We had roughly 320 entries, and a little more than half of those were professional teams. About 180 of those entries were professional teams, and the rest were student teams. So what you see here is a combination of a variety of different entries. We had 5 finalists, and these are the 5 finalists. Some of their names might be familiar to you. And we had 1 winner, and the winner was a project called Carbon Tap Tunnel Algae Park by Port. And really the importance of these projects for me was that they instigated a research trajectory around what I might mean, how I might define, and how all of us at City Lab actually worked on this, how we might define next generation infrastructure criteria. And the first 7 came out of this competition. So briefly, they are, I'm gonna go over each of them. Multifunctional, right? So we can no longer afford to do infrastructure that only does one thing with the space we have. We don't have the assets, we don't have the resources to do that anymore, nor should we. Next gen infrastructure is public. So it is our new public realm where public life happens and not just where public tax dollars are spent. So it has to support inclusivity, engagements, and difference. And it has to be civic space. Next gen infrastructure is also visible. So we can see our resource consumption and we can take accountability and responsibility for its impact on the commons. It should be socially productive, so it increases rather than decreases equity, and it provides new amenities, new access, and new opportunities while decreasing negative impacts. It should be locally specific, flexible, and adaptable. So it recognizes the need to change over time and to adapt to people and technology and to be specific to the communities where it is. It is sensitive to the eco-economy, so it recognizes the interconnection of complex economic and ecological systems and how co-reliant they are on each other. And it should be driven by design. So design prototypes or demonstration projects are part of it, but also that this is space that should be support quality of life and can serve as space for enjoyable human and non-human occupation. So those 7 were then joined by 4 other criteria as I continued to work with students at University of Arizona, where I was the director of the Sustainable City Project, and then at WashU, where I am now an urban design professor. So the additional 4, symbiotic. How do you use the byproducts of one process to fuel another? Technologically smart. So how do you use technology to improve performance, safety, and access, but particularly in service of all of the criteria? How do you develop these systems across disciplines and agencies? So find new ways to break down silos and new opportunities for creative solutions. And how do we operate at the micro and macro scales simultaneously? So we went back for the book and really looked at a couple of the projects and wanted to just redocument how the WPA 2.0 finalists showed how these 11 criteria were integrated into their solutions. And they work at all scales. So this is a project by Infranet Lab for the Salton Sea, which is a new kind of economy. Hydrogenic City is a project by AirShop, which actually reinvents the water infrastructure of Los Angeles to be multifunctional and public. And then this project, which I love, and I secretly say, though I'm sure some of you have heard this before, that this is one of my favorites, the border wall is infrastructure. And I love that it's the only project that was actually built when Ron Real took the teeter-totter out to the wall between the US and Mexico. So if we have these 11 criteria that emerge from these projects, I think the question that often comes up is like, how do we achieve these, right? What are the strategies that we move from having this idea to putting this idea in practice? So I say there are three ways: broadening the process, measuring what matters, and transforming the prototype so that we can shift the paradigm. So what do I mean by each of those? Well, one of the things we're doing right now is broadening the process by working across disciplines. So even like collaborating between planning and design schools, but also the bigger project that Paul and I are working on with University City Exchange and the Belmont Partners, stakeholders, experts, locals, tribal elders. As we bring people together to have this conversation, we're broadening the process. We also, in St. Louis, one of the things we've been doing is incorporating local artists as a portion of our community engagement. So providing power and agency to community members is part of broadening the process. The second one is measuring what matters. So and this is a tough one, right? Rather than just saying we've got to have growth for the sake of growth, we've got to promote economic development at all costs, we have to stop thinking that good dollars and bad dollars are the same. So genuine progress indicator is one strategy that measures the difference between good dollars and bad dollars. So one of the examples they often use is a divorce, right? Well, you've got two houses, so that must be great. Or war, right? You've got to buy a lot of different kinds of things to ramp up that war machine. Those aren't necessarily good dollars when you compare them to, say, dollars for schools. The other thing GPI accounts for is losses. So loss of animal habitat or loss of air quality. Those are cost. Or loss of social cohesivity. That is a cost. So it takes into account things that might be difficult to measure, but also qualitative as well as quantitative measures. And I sometimes call this measuring what matters. So we've also been looking at a project in St. Louis where we're trying to evaluate the cost of root shock. So there's a series of projects where the city is saying, oh, this was a big gain because we got tax dollars. Well, we lost a number of businesses, a number of multi-generational homes, a number of human relationships. How are we measuring that kind of cost? And then the third one, transforming the prototype. How do we stop designing like it's 1956, 20th century infrastructure, move away from solutions that are obsolete, unsustainable, and start thinking about bigger goals than efficiencies of service? And one way is to think about infrastructural bundling. So these are three kind of strategies: co-location, multifunctional, and symbiotic. And of course, symbiotic is the best because you can get a reduction of waste. At the same time, you're capitalizing on other kinds of resources and assets. So I want to share, one other way we've transformed the prototype. On the right, the image is an image from work I've been doing with Virgin Hyperloop One. So when you start to think about how we move goods throughout the country, we have entirely new technologies that we're not even thinking of. That's at the bigger scale. The much smaller scale is the project on the left, which was called First Class Meal. And it was what I call a project that takes too littles and too muches and combines them. So this was food waste combined with the US Postal Service and how we might use the excess capacity of the Postal Service to deliver excess fruits and vegetables to people who need it. So those are working at really vastly different scales. So I wanna talk about two case studies that exemplify this work, putting this work into practice. And they, the one on the left, the I-11 Super Corridor, was a project that I worked on while I was the head of the Sustainable City Project at the University of Arizona. It's a much bigger project. It's 480 miles of work. This is the map that we're looking at part of this project right now. And the one on the right is a much smaller project and kind of a different condition. So the St. Louis condition is an extension of the North Side, South Side Metrolink. It's about 17 miles. Both are going to be using infrastructural opportunism strategies. The Arizona project has a lot of conditions that deal with climate, heat. You're all here, you understand that on this 75-degree day in February. The St. Louis project is much more focused on social equity. So, so it's a nice comparison between these two projects and how these aspects might be applied in different situations. So the I-11 Super Corridor project is a partnership with many different universities and many different people. So we at University of Arizona, the team that I was working with partnered with a team at ASU and partnered with a team at UNLV. We also worked with the Arizona Department of Transportation, the Nevada Department of Transportation, the Sonoran Institute. So we were already sort of broadening the process. We had amazing funding from the Walton Sustainable Solutions Initiative here at ASU. So shout out and thank you to them for funding that project, and the Renewable Energy Network at U of A. I think I said this is about 480 miles long. So if we go back to my thesis, like how do we go from the red arrow scenario to the green arrow scenario? The question on this project was, it's $17 to $75 million per lane per mile. What are you going to do with it that's more than just the flat and black road? We selected 12 sites to look at along this route. And I'm going to show you an example of what those projects look like. Before we started, though, we knew that the argument from ADOT, the core argument of the supporters of the road, and maybe a little bit from ADOT, and I'll talk about that in a second, was to accommodate growth. Right? We need to plan for massive population growth, massive traffic growth, but on the flip side, we also want to encourage growth, right? So I-11, the idea of I-11 is that it would also be a conduit for manufacturing and development. So what you see here, though, on the left is a little excerpt from the corridor justification report. And what was exciting to us in that report was that it already hinted that they wanted this corridor to be multimodal. They were interested in infrastructural bundling, and they even said, and the quotes on the screen, build a smart or green corridor of the future. So that's kind of how we got ADOT at the table with us, is because they were already interested in doing something different. So we, and I worked with Mike Chester and our other partners at ASU and U of A on developing this first scenario on the right, which is if we make a couple little changes, we can debunk this idea that you need a bigger road because we have more traffic. So we said, shift a little bit of the growth pattern from a standard sprawl pattern to a smart pattern, right? Higher density, less reliant on cars. Reduce the increase inter and intercity transit. So Tucson was already building a new modern streetcar. How else can we improve that intercity connectivity? But also ADOT had already done a study on train connectivity, light rail connectivity, really across this larger corridor. Increase electric vehicles by about 1% and move about 10% of the truck freight to rail. If we just did that, we would save about 2.1 million metric tons of CO2 per year, which is about 20% of the estimated growth from that population and development increase. So we said, okay, just do that to start with. Now let's look at the context, right? We have tons of solar capacity, and yet only roughly 8%. And I know many of you out there might have newer numbers than these, but these are the newest. I actually tried to look them up recently. So we know we can produce a lot more solar energy to use here in Arizona than we are. We also know that there's an energy water nexus, right? That we're spending a lot of energy moving water 336 miles down the cap. And that water is being moved to support the 4 million plus or minus people and 300,000 acres of irrigated farmland. So not super efficient, but these are challenges and opportunities. And at the same time, there's a fairly high poverty rate in this region. So when you look at things like unemployment, you do have to think about next generation training and looking at the population of people who visit. 2.3 million people are visiting for the beautiful natural environment. How do you preserve that at the same time? So this was sort of the basis of the student projects. And I want to quickly show 3 student projects. And these were collaborative teams. So planning students, landscape architecture students, and architecture students. And the idea for the Tucson project was really to focus on how this could become an energy hub. The analysis of this area said there's increases happening in bike and ped use, there's increases happening in transit. It's got a huge opportunity for solar. So Next Energy City was really about creating a precedent for a sustainable, engaged, and healthy urban environment around this idea of solar energy as a driver, all kinds of renewable energy. There's solar, there's kinetic, there's wind. The students did this in a really quick time frame. So there was like a 3-week competition, which these are 2 boards from that 3-week competition. And then they had another probably 6 weeks to develop the project. So this is that hub. Most of the teams put something like a hyperloop or high-speed rail connecting all the way down the center core of the I-11, which I hope we're going to keep talking about in the next couple of days. used a variety of different sorts of technology, everything from solar, roads, to smart facades. And then at the end, we asked the students to measure what matters. How much energy are you producing? How much water are you harvesting? And where does that energy and water go? Marana, same process. So Marana is north of Tucson. It's situated between the CAP, the new future Interstate 11, and the railroad. And it has a tremendous amount of water rights from a history of agriculture. So this site really looked at what that water could be used for in a very efficient and sustainable way. So it's recycled, circulated through the land, returned to the aquifer. And this node was really about education. Like, how do you start to identify a new sort of educational model for a place that's kind of between Phoenix and Tucson, but wants to develop its own identity? So smart buildings, vegetative facades, digital facades, water collection, and then a greenway. So that many of those water rights, like I said, were returned to the aquifer, but were also put into creating quality of life for the people who would be living here. And then again, a results diagram. So how much energy are we producing? How much water are we harvesting? And how much educational landscape are we creating for people who might be moving, living, and working in Marana? And then lastly, I included this because one of the topics of our conversation is really the idea of a logistics hub. So we looked at Casa Grande as a potential site for, at that time, it was the Gigafactory, the Tesla battery factory that was under consideration. And the Casa Grande site along the future I-11 has 2 highways and a railroad. And so this was, this student team said, let's do nothing but create this really large manufacturing center where goods could be produced, but we could produce all of the renewable energy on site. And in addition to providing the renewable energy for the factory, we could also provide it for the housing for everyone who worked in this factory nearby. So you see here, all of that went to the production of batteries. All of that renewable energy went to the production of batteries. Those batteries would be put on trains, or they would support the housing. Again, energy production and water harvesting. And in each of these cases, that water harvesting is going to recharge rivers, recharge the aquifer, and support animal and plant habitat. So in addition to that, 20% offset that we provided by our shifts in modalities and behaviors, we also had all of these other benefits to the design projects that we don't have a number for, but we can see kind of the benefits there. The St. Louis project is a little bit different. So like I said, St. Louis is a different kind of city. It has different kinds of problems, but we kind of went through the same process. Our core team was very diverse. We had partners from the Bi-State Development, which is our Metro, Citizens for Modern Transit, which is an advocacy organization, artists, advisors, students, GIS and mapping specialists, landscape architects, and urban designers. And to give you just a little bit of background on St. Louis, St. Louis is we don't like to say a shrinking city. It's a sort of flat city in terms of growth. A lot of the population in St. Louis has moved from the city proper to the county. So at its peak in around 1940, St. Louis had 856,000 people. Now, St. Louis has even dropped a little bit below this number. So it's around 305,000. So that's over a 60% drop in population. A lot of that drop is happening on the north side of the city, and I'll give you a little bit of data about that in a second. We do have an east-west transit line, and that line is about 46 miles. It branches just as it gets outside of the city, so you can kind of see that red, the blue to the right is the Mississippi River. The red line to the left is the edge of the city. And I should say that St. Louis is one of the only cities in the country that is not in its county. They had what's called the Great Divorce. So the county and the city are often competing for resources. So this is the original east-west line, 56,000 average weekday ridership is not all that high. The proposed north-south line is the red line that you see on the map, 17 miles, 15 wards, 23 neighborhoods, adding up to 29 stations and about $2.2 billion. So that's a lot of people to get on board in terms of collaboration and cooperation. But this gives you some sense of the statistics. So this is not a line about ridership. This is really a line dedicated to building equity. The north side of the city, about 42% of the households are at or below the poverty line. The median household value is around $59,000, and 36% of those households have no vehicles. So that's higher than the south of the city or the total along the line, but that alignment has a pretty high degree of lack of access and lack of amenities. This statistic always blows my mind. This is life expectancy. So you can see between the West County, which is wealthier, and the North City, which is less wealthy, the highest and the lowest have a gap of about 17 years. So how can this investment do more than just move people along a transit line? We did a tremendous amount of mapping, and I'll share just a little bit of these examples. The red in these two maps, well, the red on the left is vacant properties, and I always like to say vacancy is not vacant, right? So we know there is a history there to every piece of land, and every piece of land has a contested story. Those are places that no longer have the homes on them that had homes on them prior in the last 75 years. What you see on the right is the history of that contestation. So those red areas are areas that either had exclusionary covenants, were redlined, had removal of populations through eminent domain, or some other series of racial or social discrimination or violence. The redder the property, the more layers of destruction and exclusion that happened on that property. So if you're familiar with, if you can see my cursor, you're familiar with the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, that is roughly in that area where you see the three. We mapped the relationship between power, territory, and politics so we could know who the decision makers were. So who do we have to talk to better understand what's actually happening, or who do we have to follow? Who are the big property owners and who are the decision makers? We looked at levels of lead, which is the map on the right, and the map on the left is potential flooding, where we have a consent decree to invest the separation of combined sewer and stormwater. So obviously that's, if you have flooding and your sewer and stormwater are combined, you have the chance of getting sewer backed up into your house. We looked at where investment is actually happening. So most of the investment, those yellow dots, which are tax increment financing or our wealthier companies or organizations, are along the east-west corridor. The northern area of the city and the southern area of the city see very little of that large-scale investment and obviously need that investment to survive. So I want to show three projects that came out of that work. So that was our mapping and analysis. Based on that mapping and analysis, you can see where we selected some sites. And you also notice in here that the next generation infrastructure criteria are identified. These were the guidelines I gave to the students to help them think about how their solutions would solve those problems. So Karst Urbanism is a project that capitalizes on the existing cave landscape of St. Louis. So it's why we're a big beer city, is that before they had refrigeration, they would store all that beer in underground caves. So this team of students said, let's take that water infrastructure and that cave infrastructure and daylight portions of it and create a landscape of interrelated water economies and ecologies. This project looked at the highway as one of the rivers and the river as the other river, and attacked this idea of the contaminated soil. How do you take the large amount of contaminated soil, and they would use barges as a temporary holding spot to reclaim that soil, return it to the landscape to do infill, to help reconnect these neighborhoods that have been divided in terms of their relationship to the waterfront, and then create a new sort of food landscape for South City. So this was a project south of the east-west line. And then going back north to the north side of the city, if you're not familiar with the many, many famous African-American artists and athletes that came from St. Louis, Tina Turner, Chuck Berry, Arthur Ashe. So the north side of the city is often ignored when celebrating that cultural history. So this project was really about modernizing and celebrating that cultural history and providing new educational opportunities for Black St. Louisans who don't have the same opportunities that other residents of the city do. We combined a lot of these different sites and a lot of these different projects to try to measure what matters. So how were we doing in terms of actually some of the strategies set forth in the Green New Deal? We entered the Landscape Architecture Foundation Super Studio, but we tried to look at how would we measure community resiliency? How would we measure prosperity? How would we measure recovery from historic oppression? So I want to shift 1 minute away from these many student projects and just show a couple ways that this work is being applied in the creative work that I'm doing. This is a project that's also in St. Louis, and this was a competition called the Shoto Greenway. It's now been renamed the Brickline Greenway. And it was originally a project just connecting the East and West corridor. You saw how all that investment happening in the East and West corridor is already there. And our team said, this is connecting money to Monday. We need to connect North and South. So we created this plus STL diagram, presented it to the competition directors, and they said, okay, everybody has to do this now. So we shifted the whole idea of the competition, and every team had to propose a north-south connection in addition to an east-west connection. We didn't win. We should have won. We didn't win, but the team that did win has been pursuing that connectivity, and the sponsors, the Great Rivers Greenway, is actively creating a new office in North City to build this north portion of the Brick Line. In addition, they're investing in memorial projects as a way to bring back some of the history that's been lost. So I'm very proud of the impact we had on that project. This shows a little bit about our proposal, where we saw these nexus points as not just bike lanes and pedestrian paths, but opportunities for culture, education, health, food, finance, and housing. And this was one of the renderings that we had of that neighborhood. And this is a part of the north side of the neighborhood. So I want to talk a little bit about the moment that we're in. So the original 11 criteria are significant, but as we were reminded, in particular in the summer of 2020, the benefits and the opportunities that are supported by our infrastructure or thwarted by our infrastructure are not equitably distributed. We are still very much reckoning with the uneven and highly contested production of the places where we live. And infrastructure is often one of our largest offending products. So even though we had this amazing moment where we were boldly and visibly taking back space in the name of marginalized populations, that was only one step. So measuring what matters means taking into account that damage, but also incorporating steps to somehow make amends. Next generation infrastructure must also repair the damage done and the violence caused to populations, both human and non-human, and communities that have been oppressed, abused, or erased from lands where we hope to build. And many people are now, for the first time, learning about redlining, learning about erasure, learning about eviction. But I just want to remind everyone that, this is not only historical, this is also current. So I mentioned root shock. I mentioned measuring what matters. I mentioned that site that is actually, that diagram that I showed earlier, that site is actually directly adjacent to the old Pruitt-Igoe site, which is one of the most notorious housing sites in the country. These two sites are those dark red pieces on that map. This is the site of the new National Geospatial Agency headquarters. So this is a federal agency moving into this neighborhood, clearing this land, clearing out this entire the remnants of the St. Louis Place neighborhood to build their headquarters. And as you can see, as the figure ground was erased from 1950, 2000, 2010, 2020, the very last figure ground shows their new footprint, which is one building for their headquarters and 2 parking garages. And you can see the amount of housing and social connectivity that was lost. So I have added a 12th criterion, and that number 12 is reparative. So beyond being socially productive, like I said, reparations must reprioritize resources, add agency, and create optimism for those who have been most impacted by institutionalized structures of racism, erasure, and exclusion. It must bring silenced voices to the head of the table and create infrastructure that creates a better future for all and by all. So this is our entire list, with reparative as something that I think probably needs to move up to the top. And I want to end with just some big takeaways. So I've already mentioned that, strategies include broadening the process, transforming the prototype, and measuring what matters. But we have some really big challenges ahead of us, and I think they are more dominant in our built landscape and our decision-making than they have been in a long time. Climate change is more visible than ever and affecting more people than ever. Wealth inequity, stubborn dysfunction, right? These are the challenges that face us. Our biggest opportunity might be the pandemic shock to the system. We saw things happen that we just never thought were going to happen. Traffic lanes got taken away, bike lanes got added, priorities got shifted in ways that were not what we had been able to do in the past. The worry is that that's not happening equitably. That's not happening in neighborhoods that have needed infrastructure change for a long time. Synthetic and natural system symbiosis. We see corporations, cities doing this in other countries, creating relationships across different corporations and across different agencies. How do we make that happen in the US? I think we have to have some activism around this federal infrastructure funding that's coming. If we don't, it will be put to the loudest voice, the squeakiest wheel, and the road with the most potholes. And then the Green New Deal and its combination with public-private partnerships. I think the Green New Deal is unique in that it combines environmental needs and social needs, and is ambitious and aspirational. And those are the kinds of projects that we need. So we need to do all this to shift the paradigm and to invest in collective optimism. I'm going to stop sharing and talk to you guys for a minute.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Linda. This is really wonderful. I've heard the smaller version of this, but this is really helps a lot in terms of understanding the work and seeing kind of the details there is absolutely amazing. And actually, we have one question in the chat that the first question is from actually one of our faculty, Christian Kelly, landscape architecture faculty, and it was related to I would partially relate this to the pandemic shock to the system that you had just mentioned earlier. And he's curious on how the evolving economy more reliant on technology, leading to maybe shrinking commuter populations. And I would say maybe it's been sped up certainly because of the forced sort of remoteness of our work. Is changing, how is that changing the way we think about transportation infrastructure in particular?
Yeah. Well, there were two things. So a little book anecdote, which is, one, I will say a pandemic is a good time to finish a book, right? If you're going to be doing anything. But it also was, all of a sudden you had to shift and start thinking about things totally differently. So I felt like my optimism was kind of regularly questioned. And like I said at the beginning, the pandemic threw another punch into that. But so I started to look at what cities were doing as a part of this pandemic. And one of the things that was happening in Los Angeles, which I thought was really interesting, was they're building out the Purple Line, the new subway line. And the projection for the time frame of that was going to take, I think it was like 3 years, because they couldn't close Wilshire Boulevard, right? They were going to close one lane at a time, and well, during the pandemic, they said, we can close the whole thing and we can fast track this production of this transit line, because at this moment in time is going to be one of the most unique moments that's reducing traffic. So in some instances, we saw transit projects fast tracked, which was kind of amazing, right? And again, I was a little skeptical because I felt like there were sort of wealthier neighborhoods might get pushed to the top, but it was an opportunity to fast track some transit projects. The second thing it did was, I don't call Uber, they're not rideshare, right? They are rides on demand. They are putting more cars on the road. So the pause in micromobility and rideshare, I was hoping was going to be a great opportunity to reevaluate the policies around how those integrate or impact our system. Some cities have done that and some haven't. I think micromobility in particular, the way it appropriates the public realm for their own commercial uses is highly problematic. I think mobility variety is amazing, but we're actually seeing this kind of appropriation of the public realm that's not fair, right? It's bad for accessibility, it's bad for all these other things. So, but the question about commuting numbers, I mean, I think there are a lot of people studying this question, are the drops in commutes really sticking? And some of the research I've been reading, and this is fascinating to me, said morning commutes have stayed low. Like the traffic numbers in morning commutes in a lot of cities have stayed low. Afternoon commutes have increased. Like the traffic in the afternoon has increased. And it's not because people aren't going to work and they are coming home, right? It's because people are staying home and doing all of their work from home in the morning, but then they're taking advantage of this flexibility and they're, either if their kids are back at school, they're doing that, they're doing more of their trips in the afternoon. So I do think there's a lot of pattern shifting in transportation. And I think that's partially, codependent with the shift in housing, right? The shift in where people are living and how they're living. So, a lot of people moved out of New York, rents went down, rents are now going back up. So what does this mean? Like, what are people actually doing? So I think the good part is flexibility, adaptability, and opportunity to try new things. When Jeanette Sadik-Khan got involved with the redesign of Times Square, and she did a big pop-up project, this is a time for demonstration projects. That's what I think.
Yeah, amazing. I think I get the same sense in terms of the kind of opportunity we have here from the pandemic, coming out to really, it was this time of experimentation, and hopefully some of those experimentations stick, the ones that are 21st century next generation, and that we get rid of some of the kind of leave behind some of the 20th century ways that sort of limit us in terms of sustainability and quality of life. So
there's a part in the book when I'm sort of amazed right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I say, Elon Musk managed to get a rocket to space and bring it back again, like for the first time, and we can't figure out how to get our hair cut. It just sort of blew my mind. So yeah, it is a big time of experimentation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, we have a few more questions in the chat, so I want to get to those while folks are still on. So Adam has actually a couple questions. This first one, will you be able to make it to wildlife friendly once it moves away from major urban centers? And this is regarding, I'm sorry, this is regarding I-11.
Right. Well, we're working on it. I mean, Paul and I are working on this with our student groups, and I think that is definitely a priority. Like we've looked at at least in the original I-11 super corridor book that I worked on with the students at U of A and ASU and UNLV originally, and some of the prototypes that are in the book are really about protecting those wildlife corridors and accommodating for wildlife migration and habitats in the places where there is a potential conflict.
Yeah, and I would add to that in terms of the broadening the process. We've brought into the process folks that are experts in that are former employees of Arizona Game and Fish, and then also conservancies in terms of the sort of knowledge base and also values that also can kind of lead to a layering of values. And so it's not just one value, but there's multiple values as part of the work. So.
Absolutely. And, the Sonoran Institute has also been involved with it from the very beginning. And I think they're very protective of the land. I mean, it's a beautiful landscape.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up question to this. Again, from Adam, so incorporating wildlife bridges, planning urban growth boundaries to allow areas to remain wild, and perhaps even looking to ensure sensitive habitats are not built through with the road.
I think that's a statement. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most interesting pieces that really came up when we were working with the Tucson area is that Avra Valley bypass. Mm-hmm. And it's really one of the parts where I have gotten comments since then. I've students and other people who are trying to have conversations with local people making decisions around the local route in Tucson. And I've shared the research that our planning students did around the reduction of traffic and the lack of a need to add lanes.
Yeah, and actually, so related to this, the next question from Michael Moore, one of my studio students, is per the U of A research you featured in the book, the case for rail-based freight is undeniable. He's curious as to why you think rail isn't the absolute top priority for both I-11 and in general.
Why it's not the priority for them to develop it, or for us?
Yeah, or maybe it's not an absolute top priority for transportation departments. Maybe that's another way of thinking about it.
So, people who work in rail say this all the time about the rigidity of the owners of the existing rail, right? I mean, UP, Union Pacific, the other rail, Arizona has multiple rail companies that run through, freight rail companies, and they don't like to cooperate, and they don't like to share, and they don't like to partner, and they don't like to give up any right of way. That being said, ADOT put in a couple $1 million into doing a rail study and tested out 5 different alignments. And this is from Tucson to Phoenix. Tested out 5 different alignments, selected, probably narrowed down to 2. So there is background and there is history and there is recognition that that would be important. I have a lot of hopes that the work that we are doing, and that includes you, Mike, who is on the question, one of our jobs is to show a better version of the corridor, and to project into the right distance, into the future, the right distance, right? So we know the way fossil fuel transportation is changing. We know that autonomous vehicles, electrified vehicles, like all of these new technologies, we can already comprehend. What we don't know is the part that we can't comprehend, right? So what I've learned from working with people like Virgin Hyperloop One is the leap. Hyperloop, everybody, thinks this is super futuristic. Well, there's a lot of things that you have to sort of leap to take, 3 big steps forward, 1 baby step back, 3 big steps forward, 1 baby step back, or vice versa. And the things they're talking about, they're comparing, this is how the original Hyperloop white paper came out that Elon Musk wrote. Like he said, if I look at the information between something like a Hyperloop and compare it to high-speed rail in California, what do I see? So we have to do more of that thinking about big leaps. And what does that mean? And I'm hoping that what we're going to do on these 24,000 acres west of Phoenix is going to show an option that's not an old option.
I agree. That's why we're here, and we're, Linda mentioned it in passing, but we're, this is part of a larger workshop that we're going to be doing over the next couple of days with a couple classes to work on this. So stay tuned in terms of hearing from us about these future ideas. We have another question in the chat. From Michael Cuby. So he says, you showed a slide of highway noise barriers lined with solar panels. What, if any, are the problems with or barrier to doing this in Arizona? Any unintended consequences related to that?
Well, I think the thing we always hear first is cost, right? Like, how much is it going to cost for us to do that? And this is why I love the measuring what matters. This is why I love the accounting in other realms. And I think I told this story when we talked about this last time with your smaller group, but I presented the I-11 work at a transportation workshop, kind of a transportation conference. And there were a bunch of people in the room who said, oh, ADOT's never going to go for this. Like, it's too futuristic. It's too out of their budget. It's too, upfront spending. And ADOT was our partner, and our partner from ADOT was in the room. And our partner from ADOT said, no, like, we've got to think 50 years ahead. We've got to think 100 years ahead. Otherwise, we're already obsolete. So I think what's interesting about those kinds of projects and being able to talk to the people who are building those kinds of projects, and I actually saw a photo like 2 days ago of a installation of solar panels on a sound barrier, is really just to show people what's possible. I always say you've got to show them what's possible, or else you're going to get what's probable. So yeah, cost is one, skepticism, breaking down existing prototypes. I mean, that's why we have to change the prototype, because ADOT's, not ADOT necessarily, but a transportation agency is going to say, that's not in our book. That's not AASHTO. That's not safety standards. A tire is going to hit that and break it. or there's going to be glare. There, yes, you can always say something, but let's actually talk about what the problems are, not just count them out before they happen. I mean, one of the really interesting, there's a lot of material development around this too, right? There's solar embedded in all kinds of materials happening now, but there's also concrete that absorbs carbon. So we've got a whole new set of materials that might look like old infrastructure that might be becoming part of the transition to new infrastructure.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, a really important point, is to think about, you know, the materiality and the future of that, and especially the opening up with all these new, with the new science of how to actually, you know, put all these new materials together. It's really exciting.
Agreed. When we need baby steps.
Go ahead.
No, just when we need baby steps, we've got to take people along with us.
Yeah, very much so. And so actually, another question in the chat from Deirdre Pfeiffer, in urban planning. So do we need to make changes to the way we educate architecture planning students to realize the vision of infrastructural optimism?
Yes, we do, Deirdre. That's a great idea. Hi, Deirdre. I mean, I am such a proponent of interdisciplinary teaching and learning. And, you know, one of the things I love about our graduate program at WashU is our dual degrees. So we have a lot of students who come in and they're getting a master's in architecture and a master's in urban design, or they're getting a master's in architecture, a master's in landscape architecture and urban design. So it is complicated to work across those disciplines. I appreciate that we've taken on that complexity. And the more students we train that way, not only do they grow their knowledge and are able to be more flexible in terms of the way they work and the way they think, they get more jobs. So we have a lot of students who are hugely successful because they can work at places that they don't get pigeonholed, right? They can work across disciplines. They have knowledge in multiple areas. So yes, we need to train our students to think more interdisciplinary. We need to train our students to be big risk takers. And to fight the status quo. And, you know, we always say this, to be good critical thinkers.
Agree. We have another question in the chat from Sma. Can you speak more on the concept of vacancy is not vacant? What were the unique methods used to trace the history of this land, related to St. Louis, I'm assuming?
Oh, yeah. So that is an ongoing project. That map, when I saw that map, and that was a couple years ago, I just could not believe it. I mean, I often say now that like St. Louis is some combination of Detroit, because everybody thinks of Detroit and thinks of vacancy. South Chicago, because, you know, people think of South Chicago and they have a kind of image of like post-industrial, you know, St. Louis is just all of these places combined and people don't think about it, you know, a little bit of Pittsburgh, a little bit of everything. And it's also like Southern and Northern. So when I first looked at that map, you know, I was talking to my students saying like, you've got this wrong. And so we started digging into it. So a lot of that data is, you know, GIS-based data, but a lot of it is also Missouri Historical Society. We looked at a range of Sanborn maps.
Favorite?
Yeah, love Sanborn maps.
Sanborn maps, yeah.
We also looked at the racial covenants. So like what were the racial covenants and where did they exist? And some of that is held in city land offices where you're doing research through the city's database. Since that project, and I don't know if Paul could, I don't know if you have this to put in the chat, but I can give it to you later. So you might be able to find it. We did another project called Sites of Wounding, Sites of Healing. And it is also on my Instagram. I have an infrastructural _ optimism Instagram page, if anybody wants to follow along. So Sites of Wounding, Sites of Healing is a documentation of 220 years of racial violence and memory recovery in St. Louis. And my research assistant I ran a whole class called Alternative Atlas St. Louis, which was a kind of second variation of Alternative Atlas Tucson, which I did at U of A. And that was all about how do you create these new kinds of maps of a history that's either erased or marginalized, to reinsert those stories and those people back into the story, the history of the city. And my research assistant, Bowman Kim, took the sort of end of that class with another student in the class And we created this map, and it's 150 Illustrator slides put together. It's an animation of 220 years of wounding and healing in St. Louis. So it is not vacant. It is a series of highly contested negotiations and actions and oppressions and memory moments of reclaiming space.
Yeah, no, that's the importance of mapping. I guess I actually have a follow-up question that I had that kind of wrote down earlier, and it might be related to some of the questions that are in the chat, and I'll get to those in just a second. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of mapping and mapping as new knowledge creation? And especially in the St. Louis work, I think I'm super impressed with how it sort of reveals histories that were erased or were covered over or not understood fully. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that actually changes the communities that you work with and their understanding of their own history?
Yeah, I mean, people call the studio now the mapping studio. I think I said that the other day when we were talking to your studio. And I say this too, like mapping is design. Mapping is research and design coming together. And it is not just data, right? It is, you can start with data, but data has to be translated into knowledge through analysis, synthesis, and understanding of pulling out what's meaningful. And that happens through complex visualization. So those maps are half a semester, maybe almost half a semester of work of deep digging. And we start with workshopping, like all the students and I get together, we put, I mean, in pre-COVID times mostly, put big trace up on the wall, and I break everything down into categories. And we sort of start to say, what do we need to know to, one, better understand the system, and then to identify the important questions that we need to respond to. So that mapping process is about exposing what the critical questions are of any place through, partially through data, but really through analysis, synthesis, and understanding an agenda. Like, what is the agenda of the people who have power in this place? And how do we see those things play out through history? Yeah, I mean, St. Louis is fascinating. It's not like any place I've ever lived before. And I have to give a lot of kudos to those students who did that particular group of maps. I mean, they joke with me because they're like, they're blue and you didn't want them blue and they're beautiful. And I'm like, the blue's beautiful. I'm over it.
So the question why that kind of came up, I think, because of the discussion earlier, and then this question here, which Carla asked, is a lot of people, including politicians, would rather keep others down than lift themselves up. Mm-hmm. Are there local politicians responding positively to your infrastructure ideas being best for everyone? And I think the mapping, for me at least, plays into that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, that really bridges to what I'm doing now on my sabbatical. So I'm in Los Angeles for a year working on projects that were variations of the research. So I wanted to take the research from the book and apply it to real world problems. And I wanted to work with a city agency, a nonprofit, and a design firm, and continue the work on I-11 with you guys. And the city agency is the City of Los Angeles, the Bureau of Engineering, and the Mayor's Office. And what and part of the sell to them was to show them the mapping that I've already done. And what we are doing is we are using a variety of tools. We're just starting this process, so we've kind of been talking about it for a year. And we're building an infrastructure equity scorecard, kind of is what we're calling it, but it's really going to be a mapping tool that helps us better understand the combination of sort of existing conditions so that we can determine where investment is needed to create equitable infrastructure. So they are on board, like the City of Los Angeles is on board. And I really credit a couple big thinkers. I mean, Mayor Garcetti started with Executive Directive 27, which said, we have got to invest in racial equity across every agency. So my job in LA with this work is I am creating relationships across all the agencies already doing equity work around the built environment. There's a lot doing work around personnel and hiring and promotion, And then we're looking at ways that that work can be brought together. So we're talking to new technologies. We're talking to Esri, we're talking to Cartograph, we're talking to Autodesk, and we're talking to each other. So yeah, LA is doing it.
Actually, related to that, this brings it up for me, something that you're kind of emphasizing here, and I just want to ask you more directly about this, is the importance of building relationships and designing relationships as part of the design process. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's something also part of the Belmont work, and it seems a thread through a lot of your work.
It is, and that takes longevity, and it's one of the advantages and disadvantages of doing this through academics, right? We have a great advantage of being somewhat neutral. So we're not in a political party. We're not running for political office. Usually, we're not like out there representing an agenda, though we do support, sustainability and equity. We do have values, even if we don't support that kind of agenda. But we also have this weird time frame that the world doesn't live by. We have a semester, we have an academic year, we have summer. And so there's some complication there, but you have to do this over several years, and sometimes more than that. So that idea of building relationships and longevity is really important. Inviting people to the table so that they are participants and their voices are heard is important. When we started to do the I-11 work at U of A, I think one of the conversations I had with the students and with the partners is we don't want to be discounted out of hand as being unrealistic. And to do that, we have to have people who are building this work in the room. And so that partnership was really important. Like, we were not working in isolation. And, back to the question about how we teach students, I think more and more we're allowing into the curriculum, we're stressing the idea of, one, collaboration, but two, also working with real partners. It's difficult, it's complicated, it can go badly. And it can really, like in St. Louis in particular, we have to be really careful that we're not abusing their time. We have new opportunities in St. Louis where we can get funding to give stipends to our community collaborators, which I think is really important. And we have to assure them that the voice that they have is heard. So I think there's a lot of rules of good community engagement and partner building. And I think, Paul, you're working on a lot of that. And I think it's developing a good practice and sticking with it.
And good to make sure that students understand that knowledge is passed along, and that in design, you're not just teaching sort of the spatial design, but also the relationship design as well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We have two more questions in the chat. I know we're kind of maybe getting a little long tonight, but it's from Kay. Regarding racial justice, I wonder if there are any cases of optimistic urban infrastructures that have succeeded to prevent gentrification.
Yeah, this is it's such an important question and so interesting. I read a piece this morning that said, what if we imagined reparation as the reverse of gentrification? And I thought, that's such a great way to think about it. So the Bureau of Engineering, who I'm working with in LA, is building the new 6th Street Viaduct bridge. And I have that bridge as a case study in the book. And it replaced a historically significant bridge already. So architecturally, they ran a competition, and it's an architecturally significant bridge. So it was an architect and an engineer in collaboration, but also a landscape architect. So there's also parks at the base of the bridge. And one of them is in Boyle Heights, which is really actively resisting gentrification. So if you're following sort of East LA, Boyle Heights is the neighborhood that said, no galleries. We don't want new galleries, and we don't even want the ones that have been here, for 50 years. Latinx galleries, like, you guys out. And so when the conversation around providing a park at the base of the bridge on the Boyle Heights side started to be discussed with neighbors, they thought that the neighbors might say, no, like, we don't want this park because it could be a vehicle for gentrification. But they did a tremendous amount of work with the community to develop what the community wanted as part of that park. And I think it's a really tough line between like stabilization and support and gentrification. And so one of the things I always talk about is you also have to concurrently provide the sort of policies that help people stay in place, right? So rent protections, investments in the kind of economic opportunities that people need, such as access to mortgages, right? One of the problems in St. Louis is if your house is in a neighborhood that is changing and you can't afford, say, to replace your roof, your position in that house is destabilized because you're not able to keep up your property even if you want to stay. And sometimes you can't do that because you don't have access to the economic vehicles that are important. So there's a lot of discussion right now about new kinds of Black-owned credit unions or informal small loans that are helping people like establish and stay in the places that they've lived maybe for generations that they don't want to leave. So I think there's a whole sort of policy and economic support network that helps people stay in place, in addition to policies about discouraging, if not radically reducing displacement through like kind of corporate buyouts, which really scare me.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think those are all amazing points. We have one last question in the chat from Luz. In general, how do you visualize the impact of rapid urbanization in high density urban areas? What type of indicators do you recommend analyzing for working on solid responses to the question?
Of rapid urbanization?
Yeah.
So that takes so many different forms, right? Like if urbanization is resulting in sprawling urbanization and you've got a lot of land use and a lot of resource use and a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of reproduction of the patterns we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you're going in the wrong direction. And we just can't support that. So I think some of the strategies that have, there's a lot of discussion historically about like the Greenbelt in Portland, limiting urbanization by growth boundaries and things like that. There's conversation that in places like this, the growth boundary is water. And that we're gonna, at some point, not be able to continue to grow because we can't actually support it. So, if you start to put a price on things that matter, like water is way underpriced. Air quality isn't priced at all. We're not paying at all for air quality. Loss of animal habitat isn't priced at all. We grow at the rate we allow growth to happen because we're not actually pricing what matters.
Okay.
So I think if we started to put a price on the loss, like the genuine progress indicator, and I will say Vermont was the first state to adopt GPI as the guide to their planning. Maine, I think, has a GPI. Because one of the people who invented GPI also taught at WashU, like St. Louis has a GPI, but it hasn't been adopted by the city. But, if we get places to recognize the cost of environmental and social costs and play that into the bottom line, it's a whole different equation.
Yes, most definitely. Let's see, we got something else in the chat. Oh, okay. It's just from the design school. This is an amazing conversation. Are there any kind of last parting words you might want to leave everyone with tonight? I think in particular, thinking about, again, we're going to be doing a workshop on the I-11 super corridor in Belmont, which is west of Buckeye. It's off the kind of the intersection of where I-11 will intersect I-10. Yep. Are there any things that you're thinking about as you go into this workshop weekend?
Well, just in light of that, let me just say that we're recording them in case there's other people who want to see them.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So I would say, this might be obvious, but think big and bold. Like we need to think not what we need to try to think beyond what we already know, and project out a value system. We were talking about this earlier that can guide our decision making. If you think about the classic sustainability triangle, economics almost always has the bigger corner and almost always controls that shape. And until we really start balancing out that triangle with the other needs, we're just sacrificing our resources. We're just giving them away, right, to money. So everything, when we think about, I think the the reparations question, the question of equity, and the bigger scope is we should always ask for who, who are we doing this for? And whose voice gets to be at that table and whose voice has been excluded, and how do we make sure they're not excluded anymore? So, yeah, I would love you guys follow what I'm doing on Instagram, Infrastructural Optimism. Buy the book if you're so compelled, and follow up with me if you have other thoughts. And I'm in Phoenix. I'm actually coming at you live from the design school.
Yeah, we're kind of across the hall from each other.
Hey, Paul.
Thank you so much. And actually, so in the chat, Leo has put the link to where you can buy the book. We're super grateful, Linda, that you're here, that you are that you gave this amazing presentation night that we're kicking off the workshop this weekend. All the students that either are seeing this live or will watch the recording before the workshop, we're just at the beginning of an amazing time that's really important for our region, and the whole Western United States potentially in terms of this work. So again, we just want to thank you all for coming tonight. Have a great weekend.
Thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for listening in.